So, yeah, because Steve Trapps was supposed to come as well, but he got a contract in Aberdeen. So, he really, really went as far as he could. So, because I used to work with Steve, so this was supposed to be like a bit of a road trip for the two of us. And then he was like, actually, I am going on a road trip, but totally the other direction. It's like, right, fair enough. So what kinds of roles have we got in the room? Devs, testers, project? Scrum Master? Yeah, okay. Right, okay. So it's always useful to kind of ask that question somewhere along the way to see where I'm pitching this, because I'm a tester, so I will come at topics like unit testing from a tester's point of view. It's it's inherent, it's natural. I'm going to do that from my experience. So this is me. I won't labour it too much, so you can get me on Twitter at Northern Tester, and I do have a blog as well called Testing is Believing. .blogspot.co.uk. I've been blogging since 2012, which is a reasonable length of time. It reads like a story of your career, and you look back on the early ones and you think, wow, is that what I thought about software development then? So yeah, it would be really interesting if I could have had that history, from when I started out as a tester. But the last 6 years worth of blogging is it's an interesting chronicle to have on your career, so I'd recommend it. So, a tester's guide to the myths, legends, and tales of unit testing. So, I've toyed with the talk title a little bit. It might not matter, but because it's more of a slight experiment that I ran with the world, which is always a nice one to do. But again, like I said, I think that a lot of the myths, legends, tales, illusions, anything. Any other classification. It works across, in terms of unit testing, it works across all roles, I think. Certainly over the course of my career, I've found a lot of occasions when a lot of roles are fundamentally misunderstood or misconstrued or just didn't have the knowledge of, weren't aware of. An ignorance question about what unit testing is and what it can and can't achieve. But I'm a tester, so I'll come at this from a testing point of view. So, this is Gus. He's a mentor for an organisation called Speakeasy. So, this is a slightly contrived intro. I will get to the point. I got a mentor through Speakeasy, and it's a chap called Augusto Evangelisti. He's an Agile coach. He lives in Dublin at the moment, I think. So, a really nice chap. Great mentor, really challenged me. But he taught me sort of one main thing, if you like. And he taught me that speaking wasn't only about me. So, because we were talking about lightning talks just then, it's like, if you have an idea for a lightning talk, you might think, this is amazing. This is the best idea ever. But that might be inside the echo chamber of your head. I think early in my speaking and blogging career, I had lots of interesting ideas which were great in the echo chamber of my head. And then you put them out into the world and everyone's like, so he taught me that. And he taught me a way. And this kind of dovetails into this particular talk as well. So, I sent out this tweet, basically saying, I want to work on a talk about what testers might believe about unit testing and how we interact with developers who are creating unit tests. So what types of things might testers believe about that? So I said, okay, would this be an interesting idea to the world? That question, what do testers believe about unit testing? And how does it help and or hinder us from interacting with developers? So, 26 replies with various different bits and bobs of information and insight, and 26 likes, 39 replies. So, that's pretty good engagement. So it seemed like a good idea. Yeah? So, tweet is stage one. Stage two, write a blog. So I collated it all and put it into a blog called The Tester's Guide to the Myths of Unit Testing, which is on my blog. And that got 1,882 views. Yeah, exponentially winning. Yeah? So this now passes the test. Let's turn it into a talk. This is me stood very earnestly by the test automation pyramid. So we'll come on to the pyramid in a bit. because that's kind of got quite a lot about it. I can't even remember what I was saying at that point. I look like I'm deadly serious about it. I look very tanned as well. I think that was, I had quite a number of conferences. So I think I was in Poland. So yeah, I look very, very engaged with the testing pyramid there, which is unusual. So why does this talk need to exist? So in your teams, who works on like a cross-functional team with different roles? Okay, so a reasonable amount. How many testers are in those teams? 2? 2 and 1. Yeah. So I think the era of, in a lot of places, the era of the centralized testing team, if you like, where you submit a request and you get some people to come and they do some testing for you, and then they chuck some information back over the wall. I think the long tail of companies who are still in that model will gradually start to be dragged into a more cross-functional model. But this is an interesting effect on testers as well. Yeah? So if more testers, if you're a single point of influence, if you like, in a cross-functional team, then you need to figure out ways in to those teams. And for a tester to interface with a developer, perhaps unit tests is a good way to do that. So that's why I think these illusions are quite important, because essentially it's like a common point of entry for both sets of for both those kind of roles, if you like. So I think the roles are being protected for the most part as well. Anybody working a team of like generalists? Have done. Yeah. Yeah. But it's less. In the vast majority of organisations, because they're still on that transformational path, they're still protecting the existing roles which are there. Yeah. So there's going to be higher incidence of lone testers, or maybe 2 testers on a team. And then also, unit tests directly influence testing in other layers too. So they influence your integration tests, and they influence even all the way up to your, say, UI tests as well. Because new frameworks are appearing in terms of like Jest. So has anybody worked with React to build a front end? Essentially, yeah. So essentially, you can write unit tests in the front end for front end components. So it's like, well, where does that fit? Yeah. So it's like all these layers, they're slightly more tumultuous and very much more, and they bleed into each other much more. Especially now, different technologies are coming, shaking up the market a little. And then the cross-discipline illusions. So we all believe interesting things about the various different concepts in software development, I think. And then every so often you get a bit of an aha moment where you say, oh yeah, I thought that was that. And then someone's like, oh, it's this. And you're like, oh yeah, it is, isn't it? And I've been walking around for the last 10 years saying it's that. Oops. And we all get those moments. So, coming up, pyramids. I think the test automation pyramid is one model of many for testing, but it's reasonably, I think it's well adopted, but rarely questioned, is probably how I would describe it. So I think there's something in these illusions which addresses the testing pyramid as well. So this is, again, so I'll go through the myths that appeared in the list of things that testers might believe about unit testing. The legends, and I had to learn the difference between myths, legends, and tales. So some of these are slightly tenuous, but you've got to have a wider framework for your talk, right? And then changing perceptions as well. So how do we change perceptions in that way as a tester trying to interact with developers to talk about unit tests? Because I've been on plenty of teams where there are no unit tests. And how do you as a tester then advocate for unit tests if you don't understand them that well yourself? It's really hard to, because you can't really talk coherently about them if you don't understand them yourself. And then how devs can help too. I think there's a few ways, and I'll come on to those in terms of how developers can really assist unit tests. Testers think about unit tests. and bring testers closer to the team and closer to the code base where they should be in order to have the biggest impact. Oh, it's hot. So, the pyramid. Does everybody know what the test automation pyramid is? It's okay to put your hand up and say no. No? Okay. No, that's cool. Not seen it before. So, essentially, if you just open it a crack, I don't know. So hopefully the traffic calms down a little. That feels better. Okay. So, the test automation pyramid. There's a few people who said, maybe haven't heard of it or are unfamiliar with it. So essentially, I believe it was I think it was Mike Cohn who first mentioned the test automation pyramid. And basically, he's kind of saying, in terms of the automation that you write, then you want lots of unit tests, as in testing at the smallest unit you can define in your code base, which run fast, are cheap to run, and you get really fast feedback off them. So you want more of those than, say, the next layer of the pyramid, which might include your component tests or integration tests. So the interactions between one component and another, or the one between one, say, service and another, if you're talking about microservice architecture, for example. And then you want relatively few automated user interface tests, because they are expensive to write. They fail quite a lot because there's a lot more variability in there in terms of the browser that you're invoking or whatever client it is that you're trying to invoke. And at the top you have like a manual testing cloud, which is slightly less determinate. This one is like an example of the inversion, where you see it at some organizations where you have very, very few unit tests or none, and then you have successively more integration tests, lots of automated UI tests, which make your life a misery, and then lots and lots of manual testing. So do you recognize these sort of scenarios? Yeah, because there are like other variants on this. There's one called the squeezed middle. I don't think it was any kind of political reference, but essentially it's talking about like a microservices architecture where your services themselves do relatively little. Yeah, so they might not have quite as many unit tests, but they might have the integrations are the critical thing there. So you might have, a few unit tests, and then like a bit more, and then so it's like a strange that kind of shape. So there's loads of different variations on this.
How are we defining unit tests in this context?
Well, that's a good question. I'll come on to that.
Okay.
Because I think that's the question. Which, like I said, I'll come on to that. So, there's kind of two schools of conceptual thought around this. It's like, is it a useful frame of reference, or is it a dogma just to find blood sacrifice? So, I favour the latter, but I have seen it used as the former, which doesn't necessarily fit with every single architecture or every single application you could think of. So I guess the example for me was, so I worked on an application which some joker had put all the logic in the interface, in the user interface. And it was just it would pass data through a very simple service and write it to a database. So it's you still have to test the thing at hand, right? So without re-architecting the system. You can advocate for a re-architecture, yeah? But what do you do when this is a very difficult thing to achieve? So again, it's there's these sort of interesting points where you need to question the model a little bit. Appreciate the concept, use it as a model. And models are wrong. Just that, they can be useful. And it's a triangle anyway. So, if we're going to get into full pedantry, so I kind of initially started out looking through the big list of illusions and thought, okay, let's look at the ones that I think relate to the pyramid, because it inevitably came up. So these are the ones that testers mentioned. That unit tests fill in the bottom of the pyramid. That unit tests remain in the bottom layer of the pyramid. That unit tests are inherently more valuable than other layers of tests. That unit test coverage is irrelevant to manual testing. Large numbers of unit tests can replace integration tests. You don't need additional tests because everything is unit tested. If you do have a suite of unit tests, you don't need to do much other testing. So, I thought, these are the things that people have heard, or people have experienced in terms of illusions. And to be honest, I've heard myself say variants of these as well. If you have a very, very solid suite of unit tests, then that is the basis of quality. Exactly. It's not, is it? So why don't you like unit tests, if you don't mind?
Largely because I find most of the time unit tests either break for invalid reasons or the source of problems are my understanding, which is better hit with integration tests, but more than anything, if you've got a performance system half the time, for example, say I've just done some TED on a complicated report, and in order to get performance, a lot of that's got to go down into the database, sort of SQL level.
Yeah.
So there's just no way to unit test that and actually get a meaningful sort of test written from a business perspective and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Because then, we've kind of hit on the, what's the classic challenge to the definition of a unit test if it reaches out to the database without a mock, or doesn't have a layer of abstraction between, the object that you're calling into your test and the storage. Yeah. But again, that's kind of a common challenge. It's like, well, how do unit tests deal with complexity as well? You look like you've got something to say. No?
I've got too much to say.
It's good. Unit testing does this to people. It's just it's quite contentious. Yeah.
It's the rare occasion when something's complicated enough and has psychomatic complexity to it.
Yeah.
Then I like unit testing, but I find that's a relatively rare occasion.
Yeah.
You have to decide what you're optimizing.
Yeah.
If you're optimizing for extensibility and performance, you might do that. Because often the most performant thing is not extensible. Or if you're optimizing for code clarity, you won't. So it sounds like you're in an environment where you're always going for optimal performance.
I think it's more that it falls on one extreme, it's either performant or it's so simple that there's not much point doing unit tests.
Yeah, well, that's that. You just have to evaluate the context.
Yeah. But I think the main things I kind of took from this was there was the overall sort of illusion, if you like, was the unit tests are fairly sort of immutable. They stay where they are. Yeah. And they don't change all that much, but I think they do. I think they're a living beast. And when you don't change them along with need, that's when I think you run into problems. Yeah. And that they negate other forms of testing as well. So, that's to me, that's that could take a team down a certain path where you value the more technical tests over the business-facing tests, for example, which you need both in a balanced test strategy. So, what's a myth? So a myth is based on reality. It explains something we don't or can't understand. This is from, where did I get this from? There is literally, I can't remember what site it was. It has a moral to the story as well. It has something that we all learn at the end and we go, oh yeah. So like Y2K. Yeah? So that's one of my favourites now, because there's so much well, that never happened. Nothing went wrong, therefore nothing was wrong. And it's right, okay, yeah, I think all those burning mainframes might have had a slightly different, attitude to that had we done nothing about it. So that's a nice example of a myth in software development. So, what's a unit? It's a business rule. What's a unit?
A test that can be written from a business owner's perspective, not a technical one.
Any advances?
Usually a class.
A class?
Or a code module.
Code module. So already, we're all like-minded enough to come here tonight, but we're all sufficiently diverse to, come up with different answers to that simple question. So, but it's not simple. I guess that's the illusion there, isn't it? I can't let you get away with that.
It's a single assertion on a business rule.
Single assertion on a business rule, so narrowing the definition. Yeah. So if there was multiple assertions, if a business rule required that, multiple unit tests. Okay. So yeah, how do you have that conversation? Has anybody had that conversation? I said, what is a unit of our code? Because I guarantee you will get like 4 or 5 different definitions of what it is from probably people on the same team. So it's a really valuable thing to have. And I think testers can really help there. They can facilitate that discussion. Because I think that they're relatively, not ambivalent, but they can step away from that decision, I think. And their existence means that things are good. So that they exist means that they are good tests. And that's not true either. That's true of any sort of test, to be fair. But, again, testers on the list, and in my experience, have said, what's up to the dev? Said, what have you built? And he's gone, built this. Have you written any tests? The dev will go, yes. And they go, all right, brilliant. It's like, but, are they meaningful? Yeah. Do they go to the database, for example? And then it's like, well, what types of tests are there? And how does that affect what I'm about to test?
It also makes the assumption the dev made that it
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that unit tests exist to find bugs. What do we reckon? No? So again, so a tester might believe that's a test, a unit test is a test. I know what I think a test is, therefore I will overlay those definitions on top of each other. Yeah? So there's an illusion there which I think testers often fall for.
How do you define bug then? Because if a test fails, I would say introduce a bug. How would you therefore define what a bug is?
That's similar to what's a unit. There's a lot of sort of testing thought which says don't use the word bug, use the word problem. Because a problem could indicate anything, right? It could be an issue in your requirements, or a misunderstanding between two people when they're discussing something. Yeah? So a problem is a bit more ambivalent. But so in this context, I mean like a bug in functionality. Yeah? But they don't exist to do that. It's part of their mission, but it's not the sole part of their mission. Yeah? And that was like the illusion which came out from testers there. Yeah? And that unit tests communicate intent. So what the developer was thinking when they built that particular piece of code. And they document the code as well. I think they can, but I think they're only one part of documenting the code. I think it is, as a tester, whenever someone says, oh Ash, well this thing does this, I always go to more than one source because I'm a good tester. Because there's so many times I've heard, Ash, this does this, and then you go like that, and you're like, oh, no it doesn't. But it might look that way, or the test might infer that way. So they're an oracle like any other. Yeah? Good as part of a suite of oracles about your product, but not the only one. And they might not corroborate the other ones. So, a story by way to back this up. I was at it was like a mortgage admin company. This was a few years ago now. And the developers ran up to me really excited after they built something and said, Ash, we've built this and we've done a unit test plan. It's like, can I stop you there? They're like, what do you mean a unit test plan? Like, and they opened a Word document with tests written in it and screenshots and things like that of, the full end-to-end software running. And I was like, that's interesting. So, but they were testing, which for that particular company was a reasonable step forward. So I challenged it. I said, well, are you sure that's the smallest unit of code that we could test? Was that the best use of your time? How do we repeat these going forward? And they were slightly hurt because they put a lot of effort in. But they were just like, well, I'm a developer. I do unit testing. They just decided that the unit was the whole system. So, what do you think? Was I right or wrong to challenge that? Leave the behaviour as it was? Do you think it was useful to correct?
Sounds useful, but
Was it practical?
not enough context.
Yeah.
You see, it sounds like a language issue rather than a behaviour issue.
Yeah.
Because that's the way we used to test.
Yeah.
20 years ago, we used to write a test plan where we sat down on the screen and here's what we established, we got that result, we documented it all, and then we'd get a little developer to try it out.
Yeah. And they called it unit testing.
Quite often they do nothing more than execute the test plan and go, yeah, it works.
Yeah.
So this isn't unit test that they're actually going to swap into a code base. This is a test plan, an old school style test.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
But they just kind of said, well, we're developers, we do unit tests. So all our tests are unit tests. So, I don't know how often that happens anymore. This was a few years ago, but it was just a really interesting example. It's like you say, it's almost semantic, isn't it? And it might be just, well, I've taken a habit from a few years ago when I was a developer at X organisation, and I've just taken it into the new parlance of this organisation, perhaps, and called it a unit test plan. Yeah. So, but then again, the developer in this example was testing, which actually was a cause for celebration because it was quite rare. So maybe with a bit of hindsight and a little bit more experience, perhaps, I would have been gentler. So, legends. Does anybody know who this chap is? So, yeah, that's it. So I love this because essentially he's acting out a scene where he has to act disappointed, but actually they show a card saying you need to be disappointed, and he just shouts out the word disappointed, and they left it in as well. I love that. So a legend is based on a true event. Heroes in fantastical locations. It's like an origin story, if like the Marvel parlance. Like the Snowbird Ski Resort. What happened at the Snowbird Ski Resort, everyone?
Agile manifesto.
Yes! Yes! Everybody knew that, right? No. It's alright. I did this at Leeds.js, and most people were like, I don't know. So, you had those legends born there at Snowbird in terms of the people who were there, your Uncle Bobs, your Kent Becks. Yeah? So one of the things that came through that was obviously TDD is a massive part of unit testing. And what do testers understand by TDD? What's it for? So within the list that I curated from my Twitter followers, so there was TDD's testing. And I was, no, TDD's about design. No, it's about both. No, it's neither. Something else. So who's a TDD proponent? No judgment.
I use it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use
A pragmatic version.
So what's your use case? Well, not your use cases, but your intent, your principles when you use it. What do you want to achieve?
My main intent, so I like, I suppose, the design aspect of it, so it makes me think about the code in isolation from what's using it, so I don't sort of couple it with big giant models going everywhere.
Yeah.
More than anything, I'd use essentially something's complicated enough that I know I'm going to have to iterate on it, so I don't have to waste all my time retesting repeatedly.
Yeah. So again, it's a different usage. It's like a complexity guard, if you know what I mean. So that's partially design, I guess. But you know, that's an interesting heuristic to apply to it, though. To say, well, you know, I might use this tool in these particular circumstances because I know, you know, there's some inherent complexity there, and I'm going to have to step my way through the code that I need to add, rather than just say, well, okay, I think it's one of these, and I've done this before, so I can add this. Yeah. Okay. Then you've got the power of clean code TM. Yeah. So all the habits of a clean coding developer. You know, code which describes itself well, not littered with comments saying, well, I'm about to do a for loop. Actually saying what, you know, why you're going to do the thing you're about to do in the code. All those habits. Clean code TM. So these are some of the legends of unit tests as well. So, I worked at a startup called Fans, a very, very crazy place. It was the best team that I've ever been on in terms of skills of testers, developers, and product as well. So a great code base, really clean. Lots of unit tests. In that pyramidal shape, definitely stuck to it. There was no user interface, well, unless you class the API as a user interface, well, it kind of is, but you know, it was very much in that mode of unit tests and API and integration tests. So, but the idea was bad. The core idea at the heart of the company was really bad. Yeah, but we didn't test that. Yeah, so we built a beautiful code base, but never tested the core idea, and that ended up in death. Yeah, so I think it's like you can advocate for unit testing and beautiful code, but you know, the business-facing tests still need to come as well. Yeah. So again.
Did they not do lean startup then?
No. It was more like I am right. Yeah. Eric Ries wouldn't have been very happy with the approach. So yeah, it was very much a very technically focused endeavor. Missed out on the balance. So I kind of talked a bit earlier on about the key thing with testing strategies is to keep the balance between business-facing and technical-facing tests. You need to have both. So you need to have a broad spectrum of types of testing in order to get a broad view of quality of your application. If you just do one type, then you're just going to get one view. And that will never tell you everything you need to know in order to make a success. And tales. So these are stories, so folk and fairy tales about unit testing. So stories passed down. Might be one person. Might be a group. Something like safe is a valid way to deliver software. You know, that's a fairy tale in my experience. No? There's a lot of knowing. Nervous laughter.
No. It's just an adapter to get people who are so waterfall they can't cope without a 3-month plan. Somebody's made a lot of money out of it.
So, tales. Devs always write them. So, you know, I used to work with a team of developers who always wrote them, therefore devs always write them, so I don't even need to ask about them. Devs never write them. Yeah. Basically, I worked with, you know, one team that never wrote them, therefore I'm immediately suspicious of all teams. And that they're not part of the test strategy. So I believe that they are. They might be for different purposes, for mitigating complexity. Yeah. But then again, most tests are there to address risk and complexity. So they have a lot of crossover, but also, you know, they can be a very powerful design tool as well, in my belief. So, I went to a testing meetup, and a tester sort of walked through their test strategy for a particular project, and it was beautiful, but there was one thing missing. So they went through integration tests and user interface and nice session-based testing model, lots and lots of good stuff, performance, from both an individual page load monitoring to sort of a wider capacity strategy as well. Brilliant stuff. No unit tests. So I was like, how strange. So I asked the question, and the chap who was doing the presentation deferred me to one of his developer colleagues, and he said that he didn't like them. The team doesn't like doing them. So I was like, that's a really interesting thing to say. As a tester, if someone says, Ash, we don't have any automation, but can you regression test this thing on multiple browsers? If it's valuable enough, I'll probably say, yeah, go on then, I'll do it. But I don't like doing it because it's not that much fun. But, I just said I didn't like them. Yeah, slowed us down. Didn't give us any value. I thought that was really interesting. So I was like, what? You've got a big hole in your test strategy. Maybe thinking too literally. So what do you think? If you don't like doing them, if you don't see the value in them, should you do them? If you think you've got enough, if your other tests, if you think that they give you enough feedback, should you do them?
Well, that's not the whole point. That's at the end of the day. That's got any value. We question whether it was giving value or not.
Yeah.
We're doing it.
You just quantify it better than I don't enough of them.
That was pretty much all I got. Well, yeah.
It does sound a bit like the iceberg going out of that.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Are you considering the value in terms of progression and future challenge as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, how long do you need to wait for that feedback if you don't have unit tests? You might need to wait quite a long time.
If you're doing your open close principle, then your unit tests tend to enforce that. Because if you change something, it's quite likely that your unit test will start to fail.
Yeah. But if you don't have them,
If you don't have them, you don't know.
or you don't know, well, you might never know, because
It might not matter.
yeah, and also, the ability to actually sort of, if you have more unit tests covering code paths that at least you know about, then there's immediately less as you go up the pyramid. Yeah, so you cover, because you want to thin out the number of scenarios that you cover. Yeah, as you go up the pyramid, your detection is immediately less. You're trying to detect sort of different problems as well. Yeah. A subtle calculation problem, a rounding error, might not come out until, say, later in the, much later. So it's like, if you don't have it, you're missing out on a significant lens on quality. But this is just kind of like indicative of like interesting discussions around unit testing and what people think about it. Yeah. Don't like doing them. Don't see the value in them. Yeah. Takes too long. These are all things that I've heard before. So that was an interesting example of how, you can build a beautiful test strategy, but then you kind of look at the foundations, if you like. You're like, well, is that built on sand slightly? Successful product though, don't get me wrong. So, So, as a tester, what can we do? Help find out what a unit is. Yeah? As in literally just sit down with your team and say, what do we think a unit is? Get 5 different answers and then say, right, okay, is there any way that we can, build some form of consensus around what a unit is of our code? And then I think that's the basis for beginning to look at unit testing as well. Because on a lot of projects where there are no unit tests, or very few, or they've been sat for a long time, perhaps, and not really changed, or they were written by developers who are perhaps no longer there anymore, it's a good starting point. I think it's a really nice way for a tester to kick off that conversation too. Yeah, because you're going to learn something. I think. I think it's also a great lens into the dev's mind about what and how to build something. So your example about using TDD as like a complexity guard, that's interesting from a tester's point of view, because essentially I immediately take from that, it's like, well, you think that there's risk and complexity here. Yeah? So, whereas if you don't get involved in the unit testing, sort of process, if you like, then are you going to get those little nuggets of information which are really useful as a tester? And then questioning assertions as well. I think, some assertions do end up in the true equals true scenario, which I've seen. So I think it's like, as a tester, I think if you're pairing with a developer on unit tests, I think you can probably help to sharpen assertions and say, well, are we like proving that elsewhere, or how are we doing that? Go on then, say it.
Yeah, so I've had this conversation today actually.
Yeah.
Because of coming in tonight, I've pulled the test. So the idea of sharing unit tests with testers, so he was complaining about the last phase he was working at, the fact that there was resistance to developers to share their unit tests with testers. And I think there's a valid reason for it. He said they didn't give him a valid reason, but the thing that I thought of was, if you share you've gone away and looked at it and come away with, look, this is all the right unit tests. If you then share them with a tester, then are you swaying their mindset to look for the same things that you've looked for, instead of letting them look at the system from a blank sheet, if you like, and take the requirements and have their own mindset and maybe come up with something that they wouldn't have done had they have seen your unit test and been in that direction?
I think there will be an aspect of that. But the question I always ask myself is, so testing has always been defined by like critical distance, which is basically what you're referring to, which has often been at the cost of closeness with development teams. So personally, I accept what you're saying, but I am willing to sacrifice some critical distance in order to get testers closer to the code base and to developers. So I think it's a perfectly fair point. I think some testers will just go, all right, okay, well, worst case, I'll just test all the same things again, test the same returns. Or they'll just think, well, I don't need to look at this now. So that's the worst case. But I would hope that, a tester would go beyond that and value, like I said, I value the social closeness to the teams that I'm working on. So I think it enables me to talk about testing in a more, rather than sort of shouting into the void, if you know what I mean. And you can ask really, really good questions, but from a position of, we're teammates, rather than a position of, I'm some austere tester in my ivory tower. It's like, okay, deliver what you're going to deliver, I'll break it with my first test. That kind of thing. So I think I accept what you're saying, but I'm quite happy to sacrifice some critical distance to get a bit more closeness, I think. Yeah. 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 So I guess the preference would be to maybe move that a little bit earlier in the... I enjoy that. Well, that won't work. What won't? Well, if you have to ask, I'm not telling you. But yeah, hopefully we could do that a little bit earlier in the... Yeah, absolutely. So, but it's an interesting point. And I think it's one that testers do wrestle with quite a lot as well. And it comes back to like the lone tester point as well. So if you have more testers around you, you get that social closeness from other testers. Yeah. But if you're a lone tester, or even a consulting tester who's like, maybe looking after one or two teams, which is a model that you see too, then it's like, well, how do you get that social closeness with teams? And I believe that unit testing is one of those things. So, and then effective integration tests as well. So if you know the coverage of unit tests, then you can think differently about your integration tests. Yeah, because say if it's like again, the microservice example is an interesting one because it bends the pyramid a little bit. Because essentially your individual services don't do too much. It's the integration which is the power. So it's like if you know the unit testing that's been done within a service, then you can focus on the interactions. Yeah. And then as a dev, so integrate with the test strategy. So your unit tests are part of it. When a tester says, oh, hey, let's all get round and discuss the test strategy, don't just go, oh, God. It's like Friday afternoon, can't you just leave me alone? Say yes. Don't conflate code coverage and test coverage. Still really common. And these things seem to be used interchangeably at times. Because code coverage, you can write, for a relatively simple system, you can write 2 or 3 tests, which will give you code coverage. Very simple system. But still, that very simple system will need many, 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 many tests to get test coverage. So don't conflate the two. And then pair on writing unit tests. It's a really interesting experience, I think. And that insight into a developer's mind, I've always found that like a really curious place to be when just walked away from the story kickoff session and the developer goes to sit down, start building the thing, then this is a good point to get in there. Especially with teams that are not quite used to sharing all that much. Yeah? Because you're not saying, well, can we pair while you write the production code? Yeah? You're saying, well, can we pair when you write the unit tests? You get a good insight into what's going on there. So we've covered pyramids, testing pyramid, useful concept. Yeah? Use it. Try not to abuse it too much. Always question it. It's a model. Myths, legends, tales. Like I say, it's a relatively contrived split on my part, but we got a Kevin Sorbo picture in there. Changing perceptions as a tester, and how devs can help too. So, bringing 2 disciplines together around a common point, with a reasonable amount of those illusions busted about what unit testing is and what it can do. Good timing. But what unit testing is and what it can do, I think that's a great starting point for teamwork. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.